Dealing with chronic pain, thoughts on Providence and pressing on. Now, let me just say from the beginning, I am not a doctor, nor am I seeking to give medical advice. If you're on YouTube looking for medical advice, you might already be in dangerous waters. I do think, however, there is a connection between physical pain and suffering and mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And so let me just say also from the beginning, I have myself dealt with chronic pain, deal with currently chronic pain related to my back, have had somewhat severe back issues over almost 20 years now. But I'm aware many of you have gone through and will go through much worse suffering than myself. But I wanted to try to at least encourage and say two things that I think are essential for those dealing with chronic pain. And the first is this: you need to understand it. And what I mean by that is you need to understand why you have it. And again, I don't mean physiologically or physically or medically or something. I'm not trying to diagnose you. I'm talking about, why do you have it? And is it accidental? Is it random? Is it what are the purposes behind it? Is this bad karma? Right? There's many questions that come to someone's mind when they're dealing with chronic pain. I found Deuteronomy 32:9 very helpful, which says, God says this: "See now that I, even I, am He. There is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal." I want to unpack that in three parts quickly. The first is this: God says, "There is no God besides me." And that's the first thing that many people forget when they're going through pain. They forget God. They forget that they are not God. They forget that they exist for God, that their health and their life is for God, but also their sickness and their suffering is for God. Paul says in Romans 14:7, "For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living." So God says in Deuteronomy, "I kill and I give life." I kill and I give life. So if you've had 2 days of life, God has graciously given you those 2 days of life. If you've had 38 years of life like myself, I was born on August 17th, 1984. I've had 14,179 days of life. If you have been graced with 14,179 days of life, you are unspeakably blessed. God's favor has been upon you. There was a missionary named John Patton. He was a missionary to a very dangerous place, a cannibalistic tribe whose his life was on the line. And he said, "We are immortal until our work on earth is done." We are immortal until our work on earth is done. God kills and God gives life. It also says, "I heal and I wound." God wounds. Do you realize God has purposes for why he wounds? He has purposes. We may discover 2, 3 of these purposes, and there may be 10,000 we never discover. What we must do is learn to lean into those explicit passages and promises where God says things like, God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He works how many things? Some? Most? No. All things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Good for us and good for him and his glory. Understanding suffering is very important. Understanding chronic suffering is very important. But understanding it alone is not enough. You must also understand that there is a time limit on physical suffering for the believer. You will not suffer forever. Paul calls suffering light and momentary. Momentary. There's a time limit on suffering. Until when? Well, until the resurrection of the dead, ultimately. That time where our souls and our bodies are reunited and resurrected again in Christ. Meditate long and hard on 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul expounds upon and draws out the meaning of the resurrection of the body. It is glorious and hope-giving. That is why 2 Corinthians 4:16 says, we do not lose heart. Christians don't get depressed or discouraged. Why? Though our outer man is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Our inner self is being renewed day by day. See, here's what we have to understand. In fact, Pastor Kent mentioned this on Sunday, that comparison is the fuel of discouragement. Comparison is the fuel of discouragement and discontentment, something along those lines. That we should not compare ourselves to others. We should not compare ourselves to ourselves. We should not compare ourselves to what we think we could do or what we once could do. We must do what we can do in this moment. We must do what we can do in this hour, in this season of life. Understanding that God uses the weak. In fact, He promises, my power is made perfect in weakness. Not once we get out of weakness and become strong, but in and through weakness. Psalm 90 is probably a good place to end. I was reading this morning, where Moses, at the end of his life, who's suffered much, is about to die, and he prays to the Lord these words. He says, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. And that's what's needed. And he says, return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servant. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. See, if you're going to make it to the end through chronic pain, you need to start your morning right. Satisfy our hearts in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many as the days as you have afflicted us. Do you see there's no contradiction between being glad all your days and understanding that God has afflicted. Moses goes on, for as many years as we have seen evil, let your work be shown to your servants, your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish the work of our hands. And so we do not suffer as those who are without hope. Why? Because we understand God has purposes in our pain. And even more than that, we press on by God's grace because our days on this earth are few. And then we have the resurrection of the body. And so, brothers and sisters, cling to Christ. Cling to Him. Gain whatever strength you can gain from Him, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And do the work you can do. Your reward will be great in heaven. Blessings